Hey, deserving listeners, it's time for part 4, in which I react to the forensic psychologist and the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial. Let's watch. My name is Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. Let's see what comes out of my face as I watch.
So the question that was asked was because you brought muffins, you said, from your husband, right? You gave those to Ms. Heard, correct?
May I clarify what occurred so that we can stop talking about the muffins? What happened was that I was getting ready that morning. I frequently bring muffins to the office. My husband did happen to know that there was going to be a celebrity client coming in because on the mornings that occurs, which often occurs, we have to actually clear the office and move the staff to the other.
Ah, okay. Muffins. I can't help but wonder if this will be the OJ trial of the 2020s and what sort of moments will become famous years from now. And I wonder if the muffin moment will be made famous. You know, if it doesn't fit, you got to acquit, that kind of thing. So what she's saying, which sounds believable, that when a high-profile case arrives at the office, which happens occasionally, I have to clear the office because of maybe security, or you don't want the celebrity to be bothered, or it's a courtesy to the celebrity because they get that special treatment or something. And my husband noticed that and knew that there was a high-profile case and bought muffins for that situation. I didn't tell my husband, Amber Heard's coming, get muffins. Like, is that what I thought what the attorney would have is some kind of document or something, or an account from someone saying that she broke confidentiality. I mean, if this is the attorney's case, like,
office. So yes, on the one hand, he was aware of that. I was getting ready. I asked him to go to the bakery near our house and pick up the muffins for me because I was running late. He often has to do that because I often do run late. He brought the muffins back to the house. I brought them into the office. Ms. Heard and I enjoyed the muffins together. I think I made a comment to her along the lines like, we can thank my husband. My husband got these for us today, meaning he purchased the muffins. We are now enjoying them because of him.
Ah, I see. So Amber Heard heard Dr. Curry say informally, my husband got these muffins for us today. Amber Heard interpreted that as, I told my husband I was meeting with you, and he purposely got these muffins just for you and me, which is interesting to interpret it that way, right? Or at least, I don't know, as I say that out loud, it does kind of lend itself to a 3-6 a little bit anyway. So then Amber Heard interprets that as, you told your husband about me. I then tell my attorneys, who then say, haha, that's where we can get her, and that'll be our final attack. And now when Dr. Curry provides context, it's like, not much of a case.
So why did your husband get the muffins for Amber Heard?
He did not get the muffins for Amber Heard.
Yeah, you know, it's like she already said the story. So unless you have other data, why are you continuing to ask this question? Plus, there's a chance that the jury doesn't even understand that it could be a breach of confidentiality or care. In fact, I find a lot of people, some people absolutely do care, but a lot of people, they don't even necessarily understand confidentiality rules. When they're violated on themselves, they don't even know or care about it. So I think the lawyer is really depending on that to be something that resonates with the jury. And then it needs to resonate to the point where they would completely invalidate her entire evaluation. But even then, there's no data to back it up. So it's like, lawyer, get off the tracks. You've lost this line of questioning.
He knew you had a high-profile client, and you were preparing for a very long time, and you asked him to pick up the muffins, correct?
I asked him to pick up the muffins for me, yes.
Okay. Now, would you agree that domestic abuse can be verbal?
Okay, good. I was starting to cringe. I'm like, this is going to make me uncomfortable. Okay, she got off that line of questioning, and just move on.
Have as an opinion with respect to the borderline personality disorder and the histrionics. You didn't diagnose, you didn't actually have a DSM-5 diagnosis. that Amber Heard suffers from either borderline personality disorder or histrionic personality disorder, correct?
That's not correct.
In fact, your report says Ms. Heard demonstrates psychological symptoms of a combined borderline and histrionic personality disorder. Would you agree?
Yeah, Dr. Curry is making the same face I would make. It's like, what are you talking about? So I don't even know where the lawyer is going, and maybe it'll be a genius move, but she's saying, is it correct that you did not diagnose Amber Heard with borderline or histrionic personality disorder? Dr. Curry says, no, that's not correct, meaning I did diagnose her with that. And then she refers to the report. Well, it says that Amber Heard shows psychological signs of this. It's like, well, now usually there's a firm conclusion at the end of a report like that very affirmatively says this is the diagnosis. So if there wasn't that, and this is the only sentence that indicates the diagnosis, then I could imagine someone that doesn't understand or is looking for a more firm statement would be confused. But let's see what happens.
Yes, I did say that in also what designation was that? I believe January 18th that report was included. Yes.
Okay. And that's what you said at that time, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
I said a little bit more than that as well.
You said, and I'll read it, I'll quote it, quote, based on the combined results of my interview with Ms. Heard, behavioral observations, psychometric test data, and review of the available records, Ms. Heard demonstrates psychological symptoms of a combined borderline and histrionic personality disorder.
I think the lawyer has a layperson understanding of what symptoms mean, as if someone would say, well, you have symptoms of a disease, but not really the disease. You just have the symptoms of it or something. I think that's where she's coming from. It's like, well, yeah, in diagnostic language, if you have the symptoms of the thing, then the label applies.
Disorder, BHPD. That's
Yes.
what you wrote in your report as one of your conclusions, correct?
And that's a DSM-5 diagnosis.
And it did not say that you were diagnosing with a DSM-5.
Now, I'm surprised at some point in the report it doesn't actually just say this is the diagnosis or diagnosis : da-da-da. And maybe that was an oversight by Dr. Curry, but maybe Dr. Curry thought, look, I just wrote it. It was just a longer form of me justifying the diagnosis.
For borderline personality disorder or histrionic personality disorder, did it?
That's what it says in different semantics.
Oh, so what you meant to say...
It did not use the words you just said.
Now, let's talk about the treatment records that you said that you reviewed.
Right, so now she's moving on to something else. So, you just imagine the lawyer poring over the notes, taking any data they can gather, and probably it was a lot, and then just selecting a few things to just chip away at the edges of her credibility. And yeah, I don't know. I guess maybe we'll never know if this, well, they often sometimes will interview jurors afterwards, and maybe we'll find out one day. Maybe they'll be interviewed on YouTube and we'll find out, did this line of questioning effectively discredit her and thus make the case against Amber Heard more murky? I don't know. Wouldn't me.
I'm going to start with Rocky Pennington. Your testimony was that out of the blue, Amber hit Rocky Pennington, correct?
I can't remember exactly what I said, but I did reference Ms. Pennington's deposition that Ms. Heard struck Ms. Pennington in the face.
In
Yes.
fact, Ms. Pennington testified that she hit Ms. Heard. And in response to that, she can't recall, but Ms. Heard either pushed or slapped her, correct?
Interesting. So I wondered about that when that was brought up earlier by Dr. Curry, that as a data point, because I kept waiting for at least from my perspective, to be convinced that Amber Heard does actually suffer from borderline and histrionic. And the 3-6 code type is, definitely provides a strong piece of evidence, but by no means, if I saw someone with a 3-6 and I'd heard minor indications of borderline and histrionic, would I diagnose that? It would just be a starting point. I would need a lot more data before I would diagnose, especially with both. Now, I would need the report, and Dr. Curry was never really asked to provide those data. Maybe she'll be given an opportunity, and maybe that's not the point of this part of the hearing, but I was waiting for that. But one of the data points that Dr. Curry did provide is that there was this moment when Amber Heard was shopping with her friend, and then out of the blue, Amber Heard just struck her. And that's an example of emotional volatility and being triggered, and that's a hallmark of borderline. And at the time when I heard that, if y'all remember, I believe I said, well, that sounds strange. I mean, it's possible that happened, but usually there's other things happening. It's an account from a former friend of Amber Heard, clearly someone that Amber Heard had a fight with. So can we, one, believe that account? And was that the entire account? Is that actually what happened? That they were just walking in the mall and all of a sudden Amber Heard just struck her for no reason? Now, if we got more detail, we might still conclude that Amber Heard completely unfairly and without any justification struck her. But it just sounded odd to me. If that's your data point, give us some more because it's not like people with borderline just suddenly strike people. There's an escalation of triggering and of conflict, even if it's just brief. And now we're hearing that the lawyer is actually saying in the deposition that Amber Heard's former friend said that the former friend actually hit Amber Heard first, and then Amber Heard may have hit the friend back or pushed her in defense. So your data point that you're calling upon to demonstrate borderline is not effective in demonstrating borderline. I think that's what she's saying, which, if that's true, I would agree. It wouldn't be a good indicator.
I don't recall.
That's a pretty important distinction, don't you think?
My recollection is that there was some sort of violence both ways in the relationship. Either way, it seemed that both of them might have been unstable. I'm only evaluating Ms. Heard.
So now we have an evaluation of Rocky Pennington?
No, I just said, but that was not relevant to my opinion because I'm only evaluating Ms. Heard.
But you testified to that on direct that was a factor, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, wouldn't it make a big difference if Amber struck first or just responded back?
Given the dynamic, not necessarily. No, it would not have.
So this is the first part of cross that I'm actually swayed by a little bit, not a tremendous, but this is the first part of cross-examination where I'm like, that is interesting. And the way that Dr. Curry is responding is not convincing to me. She, under oath, on the stand, was bringing up a data point. Usually, this is another reason why I didn't want to do forensic psychology, is because they don't just sit down and answer questions. There's tons of studying. You have to almost memorize your report. You have to do practice cross-examinations. You got to be prepared because if you don't perform well, you won't be hired again and you'll be humiliated. So, she was talking earlier, providing all of her, she mainly just lectured about borderline and then very occasionally would provide evaluation data of Amber Heard that indicated borderline personality disorder. And of the few data points that she provided was this event where she just hauled off and hit someone. And now the lawyer is saying, well, in fact, the deposition says that the friend hit Amber first and then Amber responded. Doesn't that change the clinical outlook? And Dr. Curry is saying not necessarily. And I was hoping that Dr. Curry would say, yes, that would change, because if it was in self-defense, then that doesn't indicate necessarily anything about someone's personality. Or I was hoping Dr. Curry would say, well, actually what happened, if you're going to bring up a data point like that, you probably should have memorized that part, or at least know the important details of that reported event, because you're bringing that up. You weren't just considering that in your report. That's one of your data points that you're putting out there that can be cross-examined. And Dr. Curry's saying, I don't remember. But does it discredit her report? No. But it does perhaps illuminate bias, that if you heard that event and you see Amber Heard to blame when in fact the friend initiated the physical fight, and you're looking at that like there's something wrong with Amber, that does illuminate potential bias, but I don't know.
I don't recall specifically his words, but I remember him recalling that she had disclosed abuse in their treatment, yes.
And do you recall Dr. Cowan testifying that he received a text message contemporaneous that Johnny did a number on me tonight. I'm safe in my support tonight, but I need some real help. Do you remember him testifying to that?
I don't remember the testimony, but I do remember seeing that text message as one of the exhibits.
And do you remember Dr. Cowan testifying that on another occasion, Amber sent him a text, "Johnny beat me up pretty good last night," end of quote.
So I don't understand why they're going down this road, unless it's just to drive home testimony or data that has nothing to do with cross-examination so that the jury will be reminded of it. She's asking Dr. Curry if Dr. Curry remembers a statement from someone else about what Amber Heard said at a deposition and has nothing to do with her evaluation, because even if it's true that Johnny Depp had abused Amber and all that what is being recounted is true, that doesn't negate the findings of the evaluation. I don't know why we're going down this road.
Again,
Not in this instance. She can rely on it. She testified.
overrule.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Honor. I didn't need to argue that hard, I guess. Do you recall that?
Again, I don't recall the testimony, but I do remember that being an exhibit. I've seen it.
Do you recall Dr. Cowan testifying that not only did he believe Amber in her reporting of the abuse by Depp, but that she had no ulterior motive?
I actually don't recall that. I'm not saying that it didn't occur.
Okay. Do you recall Dr. Cowan testifying that he believed the relationship was toxic and he was concerned for Amber's physical well-being?
Oh, I think what the lawyer is demonstrating is that Dr. Curry didn't strongly consider the opinion of everyone the same, or that Dr. Curry discounted some data because she wanted to make a certain case of something. Because what she's saying is, do you not know of what this other therapist was saying? Because if you had, then maybe that would have changed your opinion of things. And again, that doesn't make any sense because, like I said, even if all this is true, it doesn't change the 12 hours of evaluation.
I do recall him saying that he believed the relationship was toxic.
And you don't recall Dr. Cowan saying that he was concerned for Amber's physical well-being?
I don't remember those exact words.
Do you recall Dr. Cowan testifying in that deposition that you were present for, referring to Mr. Depp, quote, his controlling nature, jealousy and suspiciousness, addiction to drugs and alcohol, and violent and indulgent temper? Do you recall him using those terms to describe Mr. Depp?
I remember thinking that would be an inappropriate impression for a treating provider.
Yeah, exactly. So what they're talking about is Amber Heard had I believe, an individual therapist that they were, the therapist was only meeting with Amber and not with Johnny Depp. And Amber Heard is describing things and events to the therapist, and the therapist is developing an opinion about Johnny Depp, which is fine, but then goes on the record and makes claims about Johnny Depp, having never even met him clinically. And this is something that I have seen many clinicians do, and it drives me bonkers, because if I'm meeting with a client and she's telling me about her husband and there's a lot of abuse, I will form an opinion, I will form a conceptualization, I will form a profile of that person, even having never met them. Because if we're going to have conversations, then I need to have a vision of the landscape that my client lives in. But if, for example, and this happens sometimes, my client asks me to testify in court against her husband, because say over time I am saying, wow, that sounds abusive to me. And she's like, really? Is that abuse? I'll be like, yeah, that's abuse. What he did was abusive. But that's just in our treatment session. Now, I might say, I'm not there, so I can't know for sure, but based on your description, it definitely sounds like abuse. So that's that venue, because I'm there to help and I'm there to validate and I'm there to provide therapy, and that might be a part of it. They go to court to sue each other or get custody of the kids or whatever, and my client asks me to make a statement or to come into court to assert that the husband was abusive. And I understand why my client would think I wanted to do that, or that I would do that, because I said that was abusive. What you're describing to me was abuse. And of course, it's perceived that it would help my client in court because I'm an expert and da-da-da. And I have seen many therapists do this. And they get roasted in court because they have nothing to stand on. They didn't do an evaluation. They're just believing the account of their client, and they're breaking their ethical codes sometimes, because this is something that's explicit in some ethical codes, that you're not supposed to provide a clinical assessment from afar. You're not supposed to provide a clinical assessment in a case that you're actually providing therapy in. Because of potential bias. Anyway, so they might ask me to do that, and then if I said that, and it sounds like that's what Amber Heard's therapist did, in a legal proceeding on the record, provided a clinical opinion about Johnny Depp, even though that therapist had never evaluated Johnny Depp. But it works in this lawyer's favor that was said. And that's another thing, is sometimes lawyers will come in and pressure. So not only the client will be asking you to do that, but then the lawyer will be pressuring you and subpoenaing you and that kind of thing. And if you don't know what you're doing and you don't have proper consultation or supervision, you might go along with it and either get into a sticky situation or even get yourself into a legal, ethical situation. So Dr. Curry is right that clinicians should never have said that because they don't know what they're talking about and they haven't read their ethical codes or they don't have proper supervision. I can't tell you how many times I would
Have a different person to give, but I do recall him making that statement.
Do you recall Dr. Cohen testifying that if he pushed her, she was going to push him back? And I never had the impression that she was the provocateur, but that she was indicating to me she had a hard time, de-escalating these types of situations.
Yes.
Okay. And do you also recall him saying that she didn't say she pushed him, she just said, I got right back up? She told me that he pushed her down and she got right back up.
Yeah. So if the case is that Amber Heard has a disorder of personality that results in distortions of reality and lies, then you could absolutely see the client telling the therapist either distortions or spin or lies that are, self-aggrandizing. And then if that therapist believes it hook, line, and sinker, they might report that in a legal hearing that the client said those things, right? So the lawyer is now saying things not that the lawyer was making or that the therapist was making a call about Johnny Depp, but that the therapist was saying, my client told me these things and my impression was this and that. So that's not necessarily crossing the line. I still don't do that.
Saying that Ms. Heard told him that, yes.
And do you recall him testifying you could interpret it that way? I kind of interpret it more, metaphorically, that when somebody comes at her, she goes back at them, in a similar way, whether it's verbally or she protects herself. Do you recall that?
I recall something along those lines, but it was a 6 or 7 hour deposition, so the specifics are not fresh in my mind.
Do you recall Dr. Cowan specifically testifying that he believed Amber Heard when she reported the physical abuse by Mr. Depp?
I recall him saying that and following it up with a statement that you have to take the patient at.
Yeah, any good forensic psychologist would take that with a grain of salt. Johnny Depp's therapist could have thought that Johnny Depp was the victim. Amber Heard's therapist could have thought that Amber Heard was the victim. That's not uncommon because you're only hearing one side of the story. You get a biased opinion. You care about your client, and you might state, I think my client's the victim. So when gathering those data from those therapists, you would always take the opinion of an individual therapist with a grain of salt. And I don't even really understand what the lawyer's trying to do here because, like I said, even if it's true that Johnny Depp is abusive, it doesn't change the data that she collected and the conclusions that she concluded based on those data. So I don't even understand why we're going down this. Maybe we're getting to the PTSD diagnosis.
Their word when you're the therapist.
You recall that?
Yes.
Do you recall him saying he took her, that he believed her? That he found her believable?
Yes, that he found her believable.
Okay. Now, you also testified about Amy Banks. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And before we go there, Dr. Cowan has been a clinical psychologist for 40 years, correct?
I'm not sure.
Okay, well, he testified to that, didn't he, in the deposition?
I don't recall.
And he also saw Amber Heard for over 2 years, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Again, I'm sure Dr. Curry in her mind is thinking it doesn't matter how long he's been practicing as a therapist. He was Amber Heard's therapist, and therefore any opinion he has on who is guilty is not relevant in court and is not relevant to a forensic evaluation because it's well understood that there's a high likelihood of bias.
In 2014, approximately August 2014 to 2000 through 2016, correct?
Yes, he did.
For a period of time, would you agree? Okay. And
But the jury, hearing this, and especially if you just keep repeating it, it could cast doubt on her findings, Dr. Curry's findings. It could remind the jury that, hey, there's other people out there that are in Amber Heard's camp, and so, it could just be designed to cast doubt.
he also testified that he did not diagnose Amber with borderline personality disorder. Do you recall that testimony?
He also testified that he doesn't use diagnoses, but yes, I do recall that.
Okay, so that first bit was interesting because if Amber does indeed have a personality disorder, either histrionic or borderline, it would be apparent to a therapist if they understood what that was. But then, so the lawyer says, and that is interesting. That would be a data point that I would consider as a viewer, that a therapist with a lot of experience has a lot of time. When I have a client, I have a lot of time to really assess. And, as I've been saying earlier, personality disorders for me take weeks, if not months, to confidently diagnose. So for me, if I worked with someone for a long time, I would absolutely have an opinion of personality disorder, particularly if it was significant. And I was like, oh, well, that therapist didn't diagnose. But then Dr. Curry says, yes, I also recall that therapist doesn't believe in diagnosing. And there are therapists out there like that, and it's fine. It's an approach. So there are some therapists that, for whatever reason, often because of their theoretical orientation, they don't work within that language system of the DSM or other kinds of clinical labels. And they want to fully experience the client. And that might actually help the client to feel more relaxed, help the client to feel more understood, help the client to avoid feeling like a label is being placed on them. It avoids stigma. There's a lot of stigma about borderline and histrionic for that matter. So as a therapist, you are, avoiding all of that. So it's fine that some clinicians are like that. And I know some clinicians that are like that. But, and if they, when I talk to them, if they say, look, I understand diagnosing and I'm trained in it and I respect it, but it's just not really for me. I like, my style of therapy is over here. And I come from a school of humanistic psychology and this kind of thing. Then I'm like, oh, totally cool. But some clinicians will say, I don't diagnose because I don't believe in it. I think it's all a sham. And I'm like, huh? You think the whole field of diagnosing is a sham? Tom Cruise, for example, speaking of other high-profile individuals, the anti-psychiatry movement within Scientology will claim the whole thing is just one big sham. And if you create a straw man about, of diagnosing and, as they often will, then yes, it is attackable. But when you fully understand all of the research and when you understand how diagnosing is actually used by clinicians typically, then you understand that it's a legitimate area in our discipline.
And do you recall that it was those words were in his notes, but he said he had written that down, but then he discounted it and determined that that was not correct for her?
Oh, you want to approach?
I'm guessing the lawyer is objecting to this line of questioning because the lawyer is bringing up a random opinion of a mental health clinician that isn't in the room. If you want to bring that person on the stand and have them be open to cross-examination around what the diagnosis is of Amber Heard, then let's do that. But you can't just bring all this stuff up and influence the jury without the opportunity for scrutiny about this claim from this other therapist.
All right, now let's jump to Amy Banks.
Right. So I don't know, pure speculation, but I'm guessing that's what the Johnny Depp lawyer said. And the judge just says, sounds about right. Let's move on. counsel?
With Ms. Heard, with Dr. Banks, correct?
Yes. My understanding, however, is that they met with Dr. Banks, and then it was primarily Ms. Heard meeting with Dr. Banks for treatment after prescriptions and therapy.
All right. And do you recall Dr. Banks saying that she was not surprised that Amber was seeking a restraining order because of the violence that she knew existed in the relationship?
I do recall that, and it would be impossible to know that violence exists as a treating therapist or as a psychologist. Again, we're not investigators.
Right. It's a good point that I've been saying from the beginning, that the fact that a therapist heard a statement from a client that violence had occurred and believed it doesn't demonstrate that the violence actually occurred. It could have occurred. Now, when clients tell me that violence occurs, I believe them because I mean, I don't know if I've ever been lied to about that sort of thing. Now, I could have been and I didn't detect it. So I generally believe people depending on the situation, but I would never make a statement in a legal proceeding that it had happened because I understand how the law works and how ethics works, and I understand my professionalism, that I can't know that. All I know is that the person told me and I believed them, but I can't make a statement about whether or not it happened or not.
In her notes had already determined that these symptoms were present for Amber Heard before the relationship with Mr. Depp, did you not?
What I recall saying was that within Dr. Jacobs's notes, she's documented instances in which Ms. Heard reported to her over the course of therapy that she was experiencing nightmares, recurrent nightmares, in fact, about childhood abuse.
Okay.
All right, interesting. So, yeah, this is where I thought it might be heading. The lawyer is trying to make a case that Dr. Curry was biased and disregarded a lot of data indicating that Amber Heard was abused and has PTSD, and yet found that Amber Heard has no PTSD. And so the lawyer asks, you remember that another therapist was reporting that Amber Heard had talked about signs of PTSD, and then Dr. Curry says, well, yeah, I remember that the therapist recalled that Amber Heard had reported one of the signs of PTSD, but of course you need a lot more symptoms to justify the diagnosis, related to childhood trauma, so what's your point?
Do you recall that?
I don't recall the exact date. I don't have anything in front of me.
And Amber Heard was already in the relationship with Johnny Depp at this point, was she not?
I believe she was, yes.
Okay. And in Bonnie Jacobs' notes, she documents...
However, go ahead.
She documents multiple occasions that Amber Heard reports to her physical violence upon her by Mr. Depp, does she not?
There are several notes that indicate that Ms. Heard has reported violence by Mr. Depp, yes.
I thought this is where it was headed, and it wouldn't convince me, let's just put it that way. Because again, one, even if Johnny Depp had abused Amber Heard, that doesn't necessarily mean that Amber Heard has PTSD or would still have it at the time of the evaluation by Dr. Curry. Two, the findings that Dr. Curry found was that Amber has a personality type that could result in distorted thinking about being a victim or a reason to claim to be a victim when they're not, and would report to all of their therapists that they were a victim even though they weren't, and those therapists would hear those words and believe them or not, or document them or not. So it doesn't change the report or the overall conceptualization that Dr. Curry has. I'll say, again, as a caveat to this, there have been many people who have been victims of domestic violence legitimately who have been discounted as lying or playing the victim or overly dramatic, this sort of thing. And so not only were they victimized by the abuser, but then they're abused by the system somehow. Dr. Curry is here to defend their report, which really doesn't have anything to do with whether or not Amber Heard was abused by Johnny Depp or not.
As you said, admit to headbutting Ms. Heard.
Okay, that's your characterization of it, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Did you see the videotape of Mr. Depp in the kitchen?
Yes.
Okay. Did Ms. Heard imagine that or create that, or was she responsible for that somehow?
Yeah, the lawyer is objecting because the Amber Heard lawyer is essentially being smarmy and sarcastic.
Now let's talk about the testing for a moment. You talked about the MMPI-2, but that's not the most recent MMPI, is it?
No, it's the most researched.
All right, so yeah, I mean, this is anecdotal, but there is an MMPI-3, but the MMPI-2 either is, people are much more familiar with it, and there's a lot more research with it. You know, in 20, 30 years, might the MMPI-3 be the standard? Probably, as research comes out, but maybe not. You know, maybe people just really love that instrument and they just never get used to MMPI-3 or whatever. So to ask that question is funny. It's like, well, you're not using the most recent one, so you're not competent. And it's like, what? I'm guessing the lawyer understands that, but maybe doesn't understand that the jury won't understand. By the way, there was a long conversation, questions to Dr. Curry about partner violence and gaslighting and what effects intimate partner violence can have. The lawyer was trying, I think, I don't know if it was very convincing to the jury, that Amber Heard presents in a certain way, perhaps in your evaluation, because of the abuse that she's been through, not because she's the perpetrator. But again, that's not for Dr. Curry to determine. She gathered the data and made a decision. So, yeah, but I didn't want to bore you with all that because it was long and it was just along the lines of what we've been seeing thus far.
You need to have an elevated, on the MMPI, there was only one section that had elevated scores, correct?
No, that's not correct.
It was the K section, correct?
That's not correct.
Okay. And
so what the lawyer is referring to, I think, is that according to the test, there were in fact not elevations in scale 3 and 6, and thus your conclusions, were largely based on that seemingly, and thus your conclusions are wrong. And the only elevation was on the K scale. Elevations in the K scale can, not always, but it can indicate that someone is underreporting their symptoms, and it could indicate they're either intentionally doing it or unintentionally, like they're not aware of their emotions and their difficulties. And so when they answer these questions, the test is designed to catch that they don't seem to be aware of even common emotions that people would have, and thus it might indicate this, and the entire test is not valid because they lack insight into their issues, such that when they're answering these questions, it's not an accurate representation of their personality or their disorder. There's that. It also can be an indication that the person actually just doesn't have a lot of issues and tends to be on the less volatile side of the spectrum between volatility and, shall we say, emotionless or something. They might, in a non-pathological way, be more non-emotional. So it's you have to take all the rest of the data into account when you're interpreting the K scale. So, but Dr. Curry is saying, I think, no, that isn't the only elevation. There was a definite elevation in 3 and 6. Having said that, it's possible that what the lawyer is going to say is there were small elevations in 3 and 6, but you wouldn't care. But other forensic psychologists would not characterize that as an actual elevation in 3 and 6 because they weren't high enough. Because Dr. Curry just said there were elevations, but there are degrees of elevation, and there's a middle ground where sometimes you would say, well, it's not significant, it's not high enough to make a call about this.
Was there any elevated score over 65 on the MMPI?
I would need to take a look at it. If I provided a 25-page interpretation outline. If you're able to pull that up,
Interesting. That's what I was suspecting. That's where I thought the lawyer should have led with this, honestly. Or maybe this is the closer. But yeah, if there aren't elevations above 65, then some people actually will just disregard the elevation altogether. Some people will say, well, with the elevated K scale or given everything else I saw, I'm okay with applying a 3-6 code type to this individual, even though they didn't qualify officially. There's enough data there to make that decision, that interpretation. But it is interesting because the way she described it, the way I interpreted it, was that Amber Heard had definite above 65 elevations on 3 and 6. Possibly other elevations above 65, because she kind of referred to that. She said there were other elevations, there were other spikes, if you will, that were not as high. And the way I heard that, because the way that other forensic or at least people in my circle, if they said that, they would mean above 65. If it wasn't above 65, they would have clarified that. They would have said, although none of the scales are above 65, there was an elevation in 3 and 6, and let me justify why I actually made that call. And we didn't hear that. Maybe it's in the report.
Be happy to go over any of the individual scores for you.
Can you recall any clinical scales for the MMPI-2 for Amber Heard that were above 65?
The other not so good detail here for Dr. Curry is when asked by the lawyer about how high was the elevation, either Dr. Curry doesn't remember or doesn't want to answer the question because she says, I don't recall how high the elevations were. And that's a pretty critical detail that you should know and be able to answer or justify as to why you would have made a 3-6 code type without that degree of elevation. So, and as I said earlier, the diagnosis of borderline and histrionic, as I was hearing her testimony, none of it was very compelling. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that she didn't accurately diagnose. It doesn't mean that she doesn't have a lot of data, but I didn't hear much data that would support that in terms of her providing details around that, aside from the 3-6 code type. But if there isn't a strong 3-6 code type, then it does, for me as a viewer, throw the whole thing into question to some extent.
On this test, 25 pages worth listed. So if you can pull it up, then I can review and give you a confident answer.
What can you recall as you sit there?
I'm hesitant to do that because I don't want to make an error by ignoring hundreds of scale scores.
And would you agree that you can't make a pathological determination or diagnosis if the scales are not elevated on the MMPI-2?
I would not agree with that.
Okay.
Right. So just because someone doesn't have an elevated score above 65 on the MMPI-2 scales doesn't mean they don't have a personality disorder. And that was a really poor question on behalf of the lawyer. So the Dr. Curry said, no, it's just not true.
Difficulties?
Yes.
And these are symptoms you're also attributing to the personality disorder, correct?
Yes, there are some key differences.
Okay.
Finally, that's so many. I thought this is where it was headed, but the lawyer finally made that connection, that it's possible that the abuse that Amber Heard went through resulted in a trauma reactivity of PTSD that could be mistaken for something else. Okay, but not borderline and histrionic. But we're finally there. I was like, I think this is where it's headed.
No, actually, that was something unique. When she completed objective broadband measures, where the questions, you don't know what the questions are getting at, they seem completely random, she raised scores that indicated that she was trying to minimize any mental issues and appear completely free of pathology. When she took tests that asked questions that were specific to trauma, that's when you'd see these extreme exaggerations.
Right. So she said that earlier, but she said it more specifically this time, that according to more than one test, there were indications that Amber Heard was downplaying her issues but exaggerating her PTSD symptoms. Now, I will say that some of these findings can be wrong. Someone can be answering honestly and be found to be lying or to have signs of lying. And so it's not a foolproof way of determining the intent of the individual taking the test.
The MMPI-2 profile, it's specific to how she approached this test, and you're correct. For this test, It was a defensive profile, not an exaggerated profile.
So my question on line 10 was, this is not a profile consistent with malingering, correct? And your answer under oath at that time was correct. On this test, it is not consistent with malingering.
Yeah, I don't understand what the lawyer is getting at. I think the lawyer thinks that she has Dr. Curry in a gotcha moment. In a previous under oath testimony, you said that the MMPI-2 did not demonstrate malingering, meaning faking a psychopathology. That doesn't help the legal case of Amber Heard to try to catch Dr. Curry on that, because Dr. Curry is saying the findings actually indicated defensiveness, meaning a lowering of one's symptoms. On the PTSD self-report scale, there did seem to be malingering, but in the MMPI-2, which is not geared towards PTSD specifically, there was a dampening of the responses. There seemed to be an indication of that, elevation of the K scale, blah, blah, blah. I don't know about the other validity scales, but so the lawyer is like, before you said there was no malingering on it. Maybe the lawyer thinks malingering means faking in general, but it doesn't. It means you're faking a psychopathology rather than the opposite.
I also gave her the CAPS-5. I don't know if you'll remember, but that is the clinician-administered PTSD scale consistent with the DSM-5. And on that, there were signs of gross exaggeration. I also looked at the test results that were provided by Dr. Hughes, and on an objective test of trauma, there is a scale specific to intentional exaggeration on that test, and Ms. Heard was in the 98th percentile, meaning that she had engaged in extreme levels of exaggeration.
Interesting. That's another data point that doesn't look good for Amber, that there's another test that found that she had an extreme high degree of exaggeration regarding PTSD. I will say it's possible that she does have PTSD, meaning that you can have indications of exaggeration but still have it. You just don't have it to the degree that you're exaggerating, so it doesn't negate the possibility that you don't have it. But I'm now remembering the CAPS-5 that, according to Dr. Curry anyway, the responses from Amber Heard indicated that she didn't really have details about her experiences with PTSD, and people who have experiences with PTSD will have those details. So who knows? It's hard to say. I'm curious as to what other forensic experts will say in response to this. But yeah, that absolutely does provide another data point indicating that Amber Heard, at least on 2 occasions, according to objective measures, was exaggerating PTSD symptoms.
Of the professionals involved in this case had to take their patient at her word. What did you mean by that?
So when you're providing therapy, you're in a very different role than an examiner. When you're the forensic examiner, you're just really looking at data to make a decision. When you're a therapist, you're an advocate for your client's well-being. And in fact, it's considered extremely unethical for a treating provider to ever provide opinion testimony like I'm providing because...
Right. So she's saying what I was saying earlier. She is, the lawyer is giving Dr. Curry a chance to comment on what the other lawyer, the cross-examining lawyer, was commenting on. There's all these other therapists that only knew Amber's story that were claiming that Johnny Depp was abusive. Now the lawyer is giving Dr. Curry a chance to say the role of an examiner is very different from a therapist, and it's actually unethical for a therapist to make a determination like that because of their role.
Because it's so well known in our field that you're going to have an automatic bias for your client. It's almost a sense of protection, advocacy, wanting their best, which is why we also know that it's very inappropriate to convey any sort of opinion about whether a crime occurred, whether abuse occurred. We can certainly believe our clients. We can support them in their therapy and take them at their word. But when giving opinions and consultations, we have to be very, very cautious and really only provide the facts. We would state things in terms of, my client did report this. I saw this. Here was our treatment plan. Here was the diagnosis.
Yeah, she's saying essentially what I was saying earlier. And the other thing is that if someone were to complain about you, if you were to, make these kinds of determinations officially, if I as a therapist make an official proclamation that, their partner was abusive without ever evaluating that situation, and the fact that I'm the treating therapist, the partner could actually complain about me to the state licensing board, and my license could be sanctioned in various ways.
They had never so much as done an initial interview with Mr. Depp and gotten his whole life story or his symptoms or his side of any of it. And they're going to be advocating, and the treatment relationship is about helping your client achieve well-being, not making formal psychological or psychiatric opinions.
So you're asked a question about a series of doctors. Dr. Cohen, treating physician?
Yes, he was a psychologist.
Yeah. Dr. Banks, treating physician?
Dr. Banks, yes, treating psychiatrist.
Dr. Anderson?
Yes, treating psychologist.
Every one of them had to take Amber heard at his word, right?
Yes.
All right, well, that does it for that episode. Everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.